she's getting organized, imagine, just as we saw the electricity from a distance, how are we going to actually integrate all of this, the differences?
So that's really the question posed by this work, this project, is we have these 6 countries, and I think the video gives you a sense, just kind of what are some of the realities on the ground, where are the contexts in which we're working, and as you've seen, it's a very broad range of countries with very different contexts. We have islands, we have landlocked countries, we have countries on the very bottom of the Human Development Index, we have countries that have just graduated from least developed country status, and so we're dealing with very different contexts, and the goal of this facility, the Climate Change Adaptation Facility, is to be able to exchange experiences and learn from each other. So how do we take an experience or something that's worked in one country and apply it to another country when their contexts are so different? And that's where we're using this specific approach. So the challenges that we're seeing when it comes to this kind of sharing, there are really 3 main challenges. First is the challenge of access. So we have limited access and availability of information. The second is the challenge of analysis, so having a systematic way of processing that information. And finally, the challenge of learning, which I've kind of talked about, kind of this understanding of what is a best practice and what are the lessons that we're learning from one context. So just to look at that in a little more detail, Cabo Verde, which is the country we're using as this kind of pilot, as this case study, there's a lot going on in Cape Verde. This is a list of just the projects that UNDP is doing in the environment portfolio in Cape Verde. So this is a very small group, but you can see already there's 8 different projects that are happening. Now in each of these projects, and this is the Canada one that I've been talking about, you have a whole host of information being generated. So you have very structured data, like reports, baseline surveys, impact assessments, documentation of knowledge and experiences. And then you have more unstructured information. You have interviews, you have project visits and oversight. You have reports and back to office reports from visits. So you have all this different kind of information, and the challenge we have is accessing all of this in one place. So it's currently kind of scattered all over the place. At the same time, we have both this structured and unstructured data, and we have no way of kind of making sense of it all in an organized way. So that's the second challenge of analysis. So how do we take all of these different types of inputs and come up with some insight, some understanding of what's happening, what's working, and why? And that leads then to the learning. So the issues that we've seen through this work and other with UNDP is that most of our learning is not evidence-based. So this is an example from our Sudan project, where you have a story about how the project has changed this woman's life. And you have a nice quote, and you have a nice kind of relationship before and after the project. And it's a really good story, and it's powerful, and it's a good communication tool. But when we go to try to replicate that experience in another context, this doesn't help because we don't have the concrete evidence, we don't have the data behind the story. The second challenge is that we don't necessarily take into account all of the factors. So here's an example from Cambodia where we do have some of the evidence. We have the change in income, for example, before and after the project. But we don't necessarily have an understanding of who was involved, how were they involved, what is kind of the context around this specific change in order to, again, replicate it and learn for another context. And finally, this inevitable challenge of being either too generic or too specific. So on the left here, we have an example from Mali where we say that the adaptation interventions, which were focused on strengthening income-generating activities for women, was a successful practice. But that's so general, we don't know what kind of activities those are, how they were done, which type of women groups they were engaging. So in the end, it doesn't really help us, again, to replicate. On the other end of the spectrum, we have an example from Sudan where they're using a specific rural financing mechanism, which is based on traditional practices called sanjo. And that was very successful as well in the communities. But again, that was based on an indigenous practice that had been kind of accepted through hundreds of years. And therefore, it worked in that context, and it might not work in another context because they don't have that cultural, contextual specificity. So how are we going to address these 3 challenges? So the first thing in terms of access is that we're developing one platform. So, and I'll talk bit more about this, but one of the outputs of this process is a platform where all of this different type of information can come into one place. And we're talking about both the structured data, which is kind of how we're typically working, as well as the unstructured data, what insights we can gain from interviews, from oversight, mission, and discussions. Second is the challenge of analysis. So we're using qualitative methods to look at more of a systematic way of assessing a variety of different data. And this we'll touch on a bit more as well, but this is kind of what Jerry was discussing, and kind of a method to analyzing the work. And finally, learning. The platform is going to have visualizations that allow us to look at patterns over different countries and across these different contexts in order to show insights that can be replicable and applicable in different contexts. So we're really breaking down our understanding of the learning so that it's common and accessible to all countries. So in framing the initiative, again, the aim is for this analytic platform to be able to recognize patterns and extract evidence-based lessons in order to learn and replicate across countries. So first we have to understand what works. So what is the impact? So we're defining success from a number of different perspectives. And then understanding kind of the contextual socioscape, which is kind of what Jerry was touching on, around that given intervention. And then in order to understand how we can replicate and scale that up, how do we capture and visualize that contextual information, that socioscape, around the intervention, and analyze the linkages and trends in order to show what ingredients within that context led to the success of the project, of the initiative. And so we essentially have three components of this initiative. The first is the process, which is the method, and that we're calling action intelligence methodology, which is what Jerry has been developing. The second is the tool, which is the actual platform, this web-based, and we're calling it semi-automated because it's not something that you're going to be able to put in a data point, some data, and it comes out with an answer. It's actually something that you have to work with, and you have to have analysts that are working with the platform. And finally, the skills, so the ability to make sense of the data and to be able to generate the evidence-based learning that we're looking for. So here is kind of a general idea of what methodology we're looking at, and it's these three main kind of stages: the data collection, and then the classifying and tagging of that data, and then the visual analytics to make sense of that. And what's kind of new and what we're doing, and the focus is really on this classifying and tagging process. And we're using more of the socio-cultural tagging within the context of what Jerry was saying, which, when it comes to adaptation, is critical because we're talking here about behavior. We're talking about how people interact with their natural resources and their society. We're talking about perceptions, and so we need kind of a lens that's socio-cultural on this work. And then finally, our aim is to create this platform which is going to help us, again, semi-automate that process of classifying and tagging. And we'll have our analysts that are working with the platform on either side of this. So we have the data collection, we have the analyst who is helping to kind of guide the classifying and the tagging of that information. The platform processes that and puts out the visualization of that information. And again, the analyst is there to make sense of those visuals and guide where we want the visuals, what we want the visuals to show, in order to make sense and generate our lessons learned. So from a very concrete perspective, this is kind of the timeline in which we've been working on this very initial kind of stage of the project. So we're working with a team in Cape Verde who are represented here by Arlindo from the University of Cape Verde, and Patricia, who's working with us as an architect, a designer, and urbanist. And so we've been in Praia at the beginning of September to train the research team, and we have a team working with Arlindo at the University of student researchers. The company we're working with now to develop this alpha version of the platform is using that data to help guide both the input and the output processes of the platform. We've been working this week here on further design of the platform and understanding how we want it to look, and the development of the beta version will continue. And then eventually we'll have this workshop in Cape Verde to kind of consolidate and validate what we've been working on and present what the platform is. And the idea is then to scale it up first with these 6 countries so that we have information coming from all 6 of these countries and we're able to finally compare and exchange and apply information across the different contexts, and then potentially further to our broader portfolio worldwide. So that's a quick overview. We do have a blog that's hosted by CIM that's kind of tracking some of the work, so it gives a little more detail on the process and what we're thinking and some of the questions that have come up, so feel free to check that out. And we're also open to interested researchers, interns who might want to be working with us on some of this. So that's part of why it's so great to be partnering with the university, because there are a lot of people who are working and thinking through some of these questions, and we're definitely, as UNDP, open to working with these. So if there's any interest,